Andrea Marr, running for District 3 in the Costa Mesa City Council race. Thank you for meeting with us.
Thank you so much for letting me do this with you.
One of the questions we do want to know is, what is your connection to Costa Mesa? What have you done for your city?
So I'm really glad that you asked all of the candidates that question. I moved here in August of 2012, and I'd been stationed in San Diego when I was in the Navy. I briefly moved up to Washington State for a job right after I got out, and then they were opening an office in Irvine. So I raised my hand and said, I want to go back to Southern California. Please, please, please pick me. So I moved here in August of 2012. I didn't know a single person in the city. I'd never lived in Orange County before, and I was doing CrossFit at the time. So on the second day I was in Costa Mesa, I showed up at a CrossFit gym, met this amazing group of people, including my husband, although it would take us several years to actually figure that out, and just fell in love with the city and the people. So that was 6 years ago. I've been super involved on the Cultural Arts Committee. I served as chair for a little while. A lot of people don't realize that we're the committee that wraps all of the utility boxes. We also put on Art Venture, and that's coming up this weekend, actually. We do all kinds of events across the city related to art. And then I was also on the Bikeway and Walkability Committee, and so we were founded initially to start looking at how we could make the city more bikeable and more walkable. We ended up developing the Active Transportation Plan, and that was approved by City Council earlier this year. I also moved here during the middle of the charter fight in 2012. And so I very quickly started queuing into what was going on in city politics and kind of trying to understand where that had come from and why that was important to the city.
Now, district voting is new to the city. This is our first year doing it. So best you can you describe where District 3 is?
So District 3 is the area around the fairgrounds, is how I like to describe it. So it's College Park, Mesa del Mar, a strip of the east side, Monticello, and then some of the communities off of Wilson. It's a really walkable area, and it's a pretty concentrated area compared to some of the districts in the city.
When you're out campaigning, what are some of the issues or complaints you're hearing from the residents?
So most people are very concerned with public safety in particular. That's certainly the number one issue that I am focused on. This is everything from feeling like there have just been more car break-ins on their street, to asking me about whether the police force is fully manned, to wondering what the city's doing about homelessness. But all of these things are very closely related to public safety specifically.
So what are your plans for public safety?
So I really think that we need to approach this from the perspective of an all-of-the-above strategy. And so I think we need to relook at our manning number, for example, or a budgeted staffing number for both police and fire. We have not been able to get to full manning in our police department for going on 8 years at this point. And realistically, the number that we consider budgeted is probably not enough for a city with where it's at right now. So more than 10 years ago, we were at above 160 budgeted police officers. And now we're at maybe almost 140. We're budgeted for 141, but it's taken us way too long to get there. So staffing is one thing. I also think we need to look at, just in general, the resources that we give our public safety officers. So we should be talking not just about more police, but how many of them are going to be bike cops? How many more people do we need potentially in the narcotics unit? How do we make our entire police and fire department more robust so that they can respond to all of these challenges in our city right now?
What about the pension crisis that's going on? Won't adding more officers hurt that?
So we're going to spend $1.7 million on police overtime and $1.9 million on fire overtime this year. So I'm an engineer. I'm always trying to do the math on problems. There is a point where it makes more sense to hire than it makes sense to spend on overtime, and that's pretty clear. We can do the math on that to figure out that we can justify additional hires.
You had mentioned homelessness. How can you address the homeless issue for District 3?
So I do want to clarify one thing about homelessness, and I've heard a couple of different answers from people. So right now, because of the Ninth Circuit decision, we are not allowed to enforce our anti-camping ordinance. So that means technically in the city of Costa Mesa, it is legal to camp outside. And so we need to be able to enforce that ordinance. In order to do that and meet the requirements of the Judge Carter case, we're going to have to build a shelter for 50 people. So I'm not sure if you saw this morning, there was actually an announcement from the city that they're making progress. They're partnering with some nonprofits, but really that needs to be the priority. And the reality is that we're not going to have that shelter built by the election. That's going to be an ongoing issue in the city that those of us who are elected are going to have to collaborate with residents and figure out where the best place to put that, either one shelter or potentially multiple shelters in order to cover the 50 beds that we need to put in. So that's probably the number one issue, is being able to enforce our anti-camping ordinance.
So when you say anti-camping, so right now if that's not enforceable, does that mean I could camp in Tewinkle Park tonight?
Absolutely. And we're actually starting to see a couple of folks pitching tents in Wilson Park, for example, which is in my district. And so this is going to be, we cannot be the city. I actually work in Anaheim, and so I pass the riverbed every single day on my way to work. We cannot be a city that starts to allow entire encampments to spring up.
Okay, and a big part of homelessness is the sober living homes. How can we address that in District 3? I know where I live, it's a large complex, and we had fly-by-night sober living homes renting apartments and just shoving 8 people in there with no counselor. What can we do to address things like that?
So back to your previous question about homelessness, our Network for Homeless Solutions has been working with individuals and in some cases getting them rehomed. Of all of those folks that we have found housing for, we've sent back to their families, for example, 70% of them come from out of state. So I believe that the sober living homes are very much bringing people into Costa Mesa from out of state, and that those folks are then becoming homeless. On sober living homes, we're going to have to change state law. That is very obvious to me. We can do as much as we can as a city, but ultimately it's state law that's going to need to get changed. And in order to do that, we need to have the stats and the data in our back pocket showing this is the impact on our community. This is how much of our public resources are going to sober living homes. We need to be working with the DA's office to figure out how much fraud is happening, because that's another huge portion of this. I had the opportunity to chat with our police chief about it, and we think there's a huge opportunity to investigate insurance fraud in particular. There has been a series of articles in the OC Register, for example, addressing that very issue. And so, again, we need to take a multi-pronged approach with all of the resources that we have to bear.
Now, what about development in District 3? I know we have some housing for students going up for OCC. What about other development?
District 3 is pretty built out. I think that one of the things that I really like about where I live is that there are these traditional single-family neighborhoods. I think we need to do a lot to preserve those places. I just don't think there's room for high-density development in District 3, period.
One thing, I'm sorry I didn't ask other candidates this because it's kind of a new issue coming up, is rent control. So in your district, District 3, there are several large complexes. How do you feel about rent control when some of the housing that had been built in the past caused rent increases drastically, like a couple hundred every year?
Right. I would not be in favor of rent control in Costa Mesa. I think there needs to be a very specific stock of housing for which that applies. There needs to be really specific scenarios. I don't think District 3 would be the right place to enforce rent control.
Pretty much everyone in the city has had a very strong opinion on this, but just for the viewers' sake, what's your stance on needle exchange?
I do not support the needle exchange in any way, shape, or form. Thank you for asking about that, actually, because I think that's actually been an issue in the city, is this false message that there are some candidates and some people who support it. That's simply not true. I think if that's true for the needle exchange, then that's also true for the portable restrooms.
Well, you just took my next question from me.
I'm sorry about that. No, I also didn't support that. I think there were a number of issues with it, from location to our ability to provide safety and security. That being said, I do know many of the business owners on 19th Street, and I think that eventually we need to figure out more solutions to this problem. But ultimately, they're going to come from being able to home people and solve homelessness in general, rather than just treating this narrow issue.
And who are you running against in District 3?
So I'm running against Brett Eckles. There were a few people joking before Feet to the Fire that we seem to get along just fine, and that's absolutely the case. I think Brett's a really nice guy. I haven't had the opportunity to work with him very closely, but I know a lot of folks have enjoyed the opportunity. I do think there are a couple of distinctions that we need to make clear for voters. So one, looking at the money that we've raised so far, more than a quarter of my donations have come from people who live in Costa Mesa. And if you look at Brett's right now, that's about 5%. So there's a pretty different group of folks supporting myself versus supporting him. I think the other thing that hasn't come up very much, honestly, is the fact that he was on the charter committee. And then when he was also on the Fairview Park Preservation Committee, he was advocating for sports fields potentially in Fairview Park, an idea that I am completely against. And so I think it's been interesting as you look at the bios of the candidates. I think that's an important distinction. I did not support the charter. I actually wrote the ballot arguments against it in 2014, and he wrote the ballot argument for it. So there are some pretty clear distinctions for voters.
You said he supported the sports complex, but I thought he just wanted to study the issue.
As far as I'm concerned, Fairview Park should be natural, period. We shouldn't be studying the possibility of putting lighted sports fields in. We shouldn't be considering it or any other sort of in-between. For me, that's a black and white issue.
Some of our voters are really strongly going just for any candidate that will support Fairview Park preservation. Do you have plans to further the preservation?
So I think under the current measure that was passed in 2016 that we've achieved the level of preservation that needs to be there. I'm a big fan of Fairview Park, and I think we need to keep it as natural as possible. That includes restoration and following a detailed restoration plan. And in general, I think it's just time that we left that park alone as a political issue and we moved on to other things.
What about the Fish Fry Carnival?
So, I think that the fish fry has been how many years has it been? 70?
Since I was a
61?
child. So.
I don't remember. I was there and I saw it a couple of places and it just stunned me how long the fish fry has been there. I think that's one where, just to step back for a second, what I believe in is being as collaborative as possible, right? Working with everybody to try to figure out a solution that will work. Eventually, we're going to have the library built. We're going to have a 1-acre park in that location. I think there are possibly alternatives for the fish fry moving forward, but I think that I would need to work with a whole heck of a lot of folks to come to a conclusive decision about that.
One final question. Why should the voters of District 3 vote for you?
So one of the things that we didn't have an opportunity to talk about yet is the fact that I'm a mechanical engineer by training. So I look for all of the data that I possibly can to make decisions. And the other thing is that based on my Navy experience, I'm used to working with absolutely everybody from every possible background, every part of the country. And so I think that there is a ton of room for being truly collaborative on our city council, and that we need to stop being reactive to every little political ping pong ball that comes at us. And we need to start talking about a greater vision for the city, about a way in which we can use our data to drive our decision making, and overall how we can actually work with each other to get things done, as opposed to just finding all of these little issues to disagree about.